In this Ask Dr. Ron segment, I had a producer call and ask about how can I minimize excess shrink when I'm marketing my cattle. And this is a really good question that many producers don't think much about. There are really two types of shrink. The excretory shrink, which consists of urine and feces loss, and this typically happens within the first 10 to 12 hours when cattle are held off of feed and water. The recovery from this type of shrink is relatively short. The second type is tissue shrink, and this basically is a decrease in carcass weight. So we're losing moisture from carcass tissues. This tends to happen later, and for example, during long hauls or prolonged periods of fast. When we talk about types of feeds that cattle are on prior to experiencing shrink, there was a study that was done where cattle were held off of feed and water for 12 hours, having been fed grass and wet feeds like corn silage. Those cattle shrunk about 4%. In the case of finished cattle on a high concentrate diet, with 12 hours without feed and water, they shrunk about 2.5% to 3%. When those finished cattle were allowed to have access to water, they recovered part of that shrink and ended up being at about 2%. Different cattle types also have an effect on shrink. For example, if we have range cattle that are a little bit flightier, have a little bit larger flight zone, if those cattle are on an overnight stand, in other words, 12 hours without feed and water, they'll shrink about 5%. In the case of some calves in Iowa State, there was about 4,700 calves in this study, where they took some calves from ranch to feedlot. Those cattle shrunk about 7.2%. Cattle that were taken from the sale barn to the feedlot lost about 9.1%. In a Wyoming study, they looked at actually 8 hours, 16 hours, and 24 hours in dry lot, standing without feed and water. 8-hour cattle shrunk about 3.3%. 16-hour cattle and 24-hour cattle, not a lot of difference, in the mid-6s. All right. So if you notice, most of the shrink takes place early, with decreasing levels as we extend time. Wyoming study also looked at 8 hours, 16 hours, and 24 hours in a moving truck. And again, we see a similar kind of a pattern. 8-hour cattle shrunk about 5.5%, 16 hours in a moving truck shrunk just right at 8%, and 24-hour cattle just under 9%. Again, shrink happens early with a higher weight loss, and then it starts to taper off with time. Here's a study out of Ontario, Canada, where they looked at different components of management practices that affect shrink. For example, they looked at 30 minutes of gathering and sorting time, where the cattle shrunk about 0.5%. If those cattle were then weighed and loaded, they shrunk another 3%. The first 4 hours in a moving truck, they shrunk 4%. In the second 4 hours in a loaded truck, in a moving truck, they shrunk another 1%. The distance traveled in that study was 400 miles, and those cattle shrunk another 2.5%. So when we look at these collectively, it's possible that cattle could lose up to about 11% of their starting weight, okay, due to shrink. If we put that on a per pound basis, those cattle could shrink almost 66 pounds. At $1.40 a pound, that's a loss of about $91.84 just due to shrink. All right, so managing shrink becomes kind of a big deal. Here's a Missouri study on finished cattle, where they trucked the cattle 52 miles, took them off the trailer, the truck, and harvested them immediately. They shrunk about 4.6%. Cattle that were shipped 373 miles, followed by an immediate harvest, shrunk about 7.7%. Now, we could almost double those miles, okay, at 746 miles, followed by immediate harvest, and they shrunk a little bit more, but not significantly more than the first 373 miles, right at about 7.9. So cattle lose the most shrink in the first 3 hours of transport. Now, there's some other factors that kind of come into the shrink scenario. One of them is environmental conditions. During cold weather, we would expect cattle to have more excretory shrink and less tissue shrink. In hot weather, we would expect more tissue shrink and less excretory shrink. And the tissue shrink in hot weather really comes from respiration and loss of cell moisture through respiration. Another factor that affects shrink is whether or not there's an ionophore, in other words, bogatec or rumensin in the feed or the mineral. When that's included, cattle shrink less. Another factor is grazing time. There was a study that was done out west where cows were on native range, and they were either weighed in early morning or in late morning. In other words, they had time to graze. The cattle that were weighed late morning were 2.5% heavier than the cattle that were weighed in the early morning. Steers, in that similar study, handled similarly, were 1.9% heavier after 3 hours of grazing versus weighing these cattle at daybreak. And the interesting thing is that the cattle that had 3 hours of grazing also tended to shrink less at all time points throughout the day following that weight. So the take-home summary of this is that prior to transport, we probably ought to think about avoiding super wet feeds. Okay, dry hay probably is a better alternative for the last day or two before shipment. Utilizing an ionophore either in the feed or in the mineral. And making sure that we have a balanced diet including vitamins and minerals. And the mineral portion is really kind of a key factor because that's where the electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and others that really regulates the moisture of cells within the body. And the other factor is minimizing stress during the gathering, sorting, and loading process. So low-stress animal handling techniques is very significantly justified. During the transportation process, avoid sudden starts and stops and going around curves too fast where the cattle are shifting back and forth in the trailer, okay, during the transporting process. So minimize how much the cattle have to shift. The other factor is avoiding delays. In other words, making sure that the equipment is in good condition, whether it's your equipment or you're hiring a trucker to haul your cattle. Make sure that you're hiring truckers that have good maintenance of their equipment. The other factor is avoiding weather extremes, like extremely hot and extremely cold weather conditions as you move cattle up and down the road.